May I please request Sri Kundan Singh to please start his presentation?
So the first point that I want to make today is that when we think about Buddha, particularly in relationship to Hinduism, most Hindus in current times actually forget that he is one of the 10 Dashavatars and one of the important ones. So how did this situation come about? And, we had a wonderful presentation from Dr. Jaydeep Bachi when he was talking about the contribution of German Indology. And my study suggests that British Indology has preceded German Indology by a few years, for sure. When you look into German Romanticism, for instance, you have British Romanticism at least preceding by 20, 25 years, before German Romanticism actually caught on. And when you look at German Indology, you also have British Indology, which is preceded by the same number of years. So, and my understanding also is that there's a reciprocal relationship between German Indology and British Indology. So all the things that Dr. Bakshi spoke about, I would say that the foundations was laid by an individual in 1817, and the production of this particular book by that individual, The History of British India, and the name of the individual is James Mill, became very important in transforming the narrative on India. For most part, the people who were involved with the Asiatic Society, they were looking at India from what we would consider as the romantic lens. But here came an individual who wrote, 3 volumes on history of British India. And these 3 volumes, they became authoritative in terms of India's representation and almost everything concerning India in the European imagination or the European representation. What I want to emphasize over here is that the history of British India became a very, very authoritative text when it was published in 1817. This was also the reason, the reason also was because James Mill, he became an important part of the East India Company. He rose through the ranks, and by the time it was 1830, James Mill, in a certain sense, you can say that he had become the chief executive officer of East India Company because he was holding the highest position in the headquarters of East India Company in London. James Mill and his cohort were also instrumental in putting together University of London. And the stuff that he wrote in the history of British India began to become part of the academia. And when you look at the subsequent publications on the history of British India that came from the Cambridge University Press and Oxford University Press, you find that these texts are basically replicating the plan that had been put together by James Mill. Now, what is the important contribution that James Mill did? James Mill basically inverted the discourse, the romantic discourse, which was occurring before him. The Christians had started this, but I'm talking about people who would actually identify with the secular tradition. And in History of British India, Volume 1, he writes 7 chapters on Hindus. And in all these 7 chapters, what he is doing is that he is describing Hindus as savages, barbarians, uncouth, rude, brute, and so on and so forth, in as many ways as possible. He begins the discourse by saying that the Hindus are rude and brute because they have no sense of history. In fact, this entire narrative that you have around historicism and history of India and Indians not lacking any sense of history. The genesis of this can actually be traced, in the writings of James Mill. In the second chapter, he describes the Hindu social order as hierarchical and oppressive. In the third chapter, he basically talks about forms of governance. And there also, it's basically the same story. And what he's saying is that the Hindu forms of governance right from antiquity has been hierarchical and oppressive. And then he goes on to describe the taxation structure. There also it's the same story. In the next chapter, he talks about the Manu Dharma Shastra, and there's a clear representation over there once again of the Dharma Shastra that it is nothing but hierarchical and oppressive. And then he goes into talking about the characteristics of Hinduism and the manners of Hindus, and they're also it's the same story. So in a certain sense, it would be very, very difficult to basically find one positive representation on the Hindus in the history of British India. And this particular book, as I was telling you, it basically became the authoritative text in description of matters concerning India and Hindus. And I think it is in this light of what occurred in 1817 that we need to look at the subsequent developments, of the narratives on Hindus. The next point that I want to make is that it's basically in the backdrop of the hierarchical and oppressive nature of Hindus that Buddhism is characterized as egalitarian and emancipatory. And Dr. Bakshi, went into the details of German Indology, how that happened over a period of time. So this is the fundamental source where the distortion basically begins to happen. And because the Dharma Shastras had been demonized to a considerable extent, the cosmology behind the Dharma Shastra never gets discussed. And when you look into the Dharma Shastras, of course, the 4 Varnas are described, the 4 Ashramas are described. The Sannyas ashram is very well described, and and what are sannyasis expected to do, they are described very well as well. So in a certain sense, when Buddha was consumed by an existential crisis, and when he basically left his kingdom, he was essentially moving away from the fourfold order, and he was entering the sannyas ashram in exactly the same manner as it is actually described in the Dharma Sutras. What is it that he does? He basically cuts his hair. The sannyasis of that particular time, they were supposed to shave their hair off completely, or would have shikha. This is described in the Dharma Sutras. They were supposed to have a begging bowl. This also is described in the Dharma Sutra. And what we also need to recognize is that sannyas was the ashram when a particular individual was moving away from the fourfold order and was basically moving away from the Varnashrama. The Varnashrama was constituted by the 3 gunas. So in a certain sense, the individual was going to engage in practices which will allow the individual to transcend the 3 gunas and eventually become a yogi or an enlightened person who is described within the tradition as Trigunatita. This understanding is very, very very important as far as the sannyas ashram is concerned, and the description of a yogi is concerned. So sannyas ashram is specifically the time when you're moving away from the four varnas and you are entering into a situation where you will be able to transcend the three gunas and become an enlightened person. So if in Buddhist literature, if you find Buddha speaking against the varna system, it should not be surprising, because Buddha first became sannyasi and later he remained an individual who was basically leading a group of sannyasis. Buddhism was not followed by the householders. Buddhism was supported by householders. Buddhism was practiced essentially by sannyasis. And once again, when you go into the Dharmashastras, you will find that the practice of what are called as rituals today, or the practice of ceremonies, they were not important for the sannyasis. The practice of rituals or ceremonies was supposed to be practiced by people who were in brahmacharya and grihastha. Sannyasis, even today, are not supposed to be ritualistic. They are not supposed to be performing ceremonies. So I'm going back again to this crucial understanding that if you remove Buddhism or the practices of Buddhism from the ashrama of sannyasa and the world of yogis, it should not be surprising that the distortions will come. Buddhism must be looked into, from these two perspectives. So just to emphasize this point, what I'm saying is that the sannyasis, even in the earlier times, they were not supposed to be engaging in any kind of rituals or ceremonies, and sannyasis were not supposed to be following the Varna order. And this traditional understanding is still prevalent in ancient India because it's commonly understood or noted, or it's commonly stated. Jati na pucho sadhu ki. Traditional India even today does not talk about the jati of a sadhu or a sannyasi, because this understanding is deeply embedded within the tradition that with the moment a sannyasi takes sannyas, or an individual takes sannyas, he or she has started moving away from the fourfold order, and he or she has basically started moving away from the three gunas, which essentially determine the varna of an individual. Now, let me come to the second point, where you find the the distortion of Buddhism, and this is particularly in relationship to how Ashoka is described. And for that, what I'm doing is that I'm going into one of the major rock edicts that was put together in the times of Ashoka. This is Rock Edict 12. It goes something like this. This is a translation, which I've got from one of the texts. The beloved of the gods, the king Piyadasi, honors all sects and both ascetics and laymen with gifts and various forms of recognition. But the beloved of the gods do not consider gifts of honor to be as important as the advancement of the essential doctrine of all sects. The progress of the essential doctrine takes many forms, but its basis is the control of one's speech so as not to extol one's own sect or disparage another's on unsuitable occasions, or at least to do so only mildly on certain occasions. On each occasion, one should honor another man's sect. By doing by doing so, one increases the influence of one's own sect and benefits that of the other man, while by doing otherwise, one diminishes the influence of one's sect and harms the other man's. Again, whosoever honors his own sect or disparages that of another man wholly out of devotion to his own, with a view to showing it in a favorable light, harms his own sect even more seriously. Therefore, concord is to be commanded, so that men may hear one another's principles and obey them. This is the desire of the beloved of the gods, that all sects should be well informed and should teach that which is good, and that everywhere the adherents should be told. The beloved of the gods does not consider gifts or honor to be as important as the progress of the essential doctrine of all sects. Many are concerned with this matter: the officers of Dhamma, the women's officers, the managers of the state farms, and other classes of officers. The result of this is the increased influence of one's own sect and glory to Dhamma. So this is, the 12th major rock edict of Ashoka. So this narrative that you find that Ashoka promoted Buddha Dharma or Buddhism is absolutely wrong, because this is not what Ashoka did. Ashoka himself is saying that one should not be imposing one's tradition on others. And why was he doing this? There is a very clear instruction, in the Arthashastra, and I've gone through this entire book, where it is clearly mentioned that a king should not be imposing his tradition, quote unquote, religion, culture, language, dress on the people that he is ruling. There are very, very clear instructions within Arthashastra and also in Dharmashastra, where these suggestions or advice or pieces of advice are being made to the king. So then, what is it that Ashoka was actually doing? Ashoka was purporting dharma. Ashoka was promoting Raj Dharma, and Ashoka was promoting dharma as it is understood within the Dharmashastra. In fact, in Arthashastra also, the instructions are very, very clear that the king must promote dharma, not the dharma of any sect or religion, but the general dharma, as we Indians and Hindus have always understood. That is what the injunction is. The injunction is not about Buddhism. So this entire narrative that you find in in academia worldwide, that Buddhism was being promoted by Ashoka, and it was basically egalitarian Buddhism that was being promoted by Ashoka in opposition to oppressive Hinduism, is nothing but falsehood. And this perspective becomes very, very clear when we start looking into the Dharma Sutras, Dharmashastras, as well as the Arthashastra.
Sorry to
So the last point that
interrupt.
I want to make the last point that I want to make over here is that there are two things that are extremely important as we create this field, where we are critically interrogating the Western narratives, or let me put it this way, the mainstream narratives, because the mainstream narratives have essentially been formulated by the Western narratives, that we critically examine what was written on the Indian traditions in in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century. And as we critically examine, the narrative which was set in place around a particular time, it is also important to go back to the original text and look at the text for what they're saying. That's number one. And more importantly, it is important to look at the cosmology which is behind the text. Because if you do not understand the cosmology behind the text, then, then we will continue to make errors and we will continue to make representations. And I think this becomes very clear, when you look at what James Mill did, in relationship to Hinduism, and or rather the truth that emerges when you begin to look at the text around the times when Buddha promoted his own tradition or his own sect. So with that, I close. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.